Hey guys, Owen here from D20. I went to a meeting this past weekend at SAS, the South African Secular Society, just sort of a local casual meetup with a few of the local members. And the topic of the meeting was, is religion dead? Um, which seemed to have been inspired by a news story about a survey. I'm not going to look into the references. I'll just tell you roughly what it was about. There was a survey in the United States, I believe it was, in which it was determined that um, a growing number of people are identifying as being not religious. So that's not to say that religion is dead or even dying necessarily, just that it's becoming less popular in one particular country in the world. I don't think it's accurate to say that religion is dead or dying in any meaningful sense, because it's still prevalent. It's ubiquitous throughout the world. Just because it's rolling back a little bit in one country doesn't really mean anything in the grand scheme of things. But the discussion that this spurred went into other interesting directions, and it sort of got me thinking, and I had a couple of thoughts about some of these ideas, and I thought maybe I'd just sort of put them in a video, and maybe there can be a conversation about it. So my thoughts went along these lines, is that we were talking about how certain religions are, or at least appear to be, sort of inherently dangerous, bad, harmful. They sort of tend towards extremism, and when it does tend towards extremism, that's when religious based violence becomes an issue. Pogroms, crusades, jihad, that kind of thing. And some people were arguing that there are certain religions which don't tend in that direction at all. The name Buddhism was thrown out there, and of course, I had to point out that the Muslim inhabitants of Myanmar over the last few years would strongly disagree with that, which is a place where Buddhist extremists, you could argue that that's the case, have engaged in what some people would call the genocide over the last few years. The Muslim population have been forced out, and many were killed. And this is by all accounts, by all appearances, done by roving bands of Buddhist extremists. Um, this may seem counterintuitive to people who don't know much about Buddhism. In the West, we kind of have a milk toast version perception of what Buddhism is. That it's a kind of a philosophy about personal enlightenment, and that's all really it is. Sure, that's not wrong. It's kind of sort of like that, but there's a lot more to it, and in the East, in places like India and Tibet and Myanmar, certainly, you'll see that there's a lot more going on in Buddhism than we like to think of. I think that there is in the West. There certainly is a dark side. There certainly are interpretations of Buddhist teachings that can lead people towards extremist behavior. I'll grant that there are far fewer violent extremist Buddhists than there are violent extremist Christians or Muslims. But to say that it never happens is evidently not true. But in the course of the discussion, was thinking that uh, I don't think that it's inherently religion that is to blame for this. We can't necessarily point to religion as being the culprit, because plenty of people are religious and they don't become violent extremists. I suspect that, and of course, there are people who are violent extremists who are not religious at all. So I proposed and continue to submit that the umbrella for this kind of violent extremism is not inherently religion in and of itself, but rather sort of the broader category of ideology. Religion, of course, being a subset of ideology. And it's when ideology goes bad that's when you start seeing violent extremists. So in the context of a religious ideology, then you're looking at an Islamist jihadi suicide bomber, for example, would be a good example of ideology gone bad. But there are other examples too. Things like National Socialism, the Nazis, communism is ideology gone bad. Intersectional feminism, white supremacy. All of these things are ideologies that start off in an interesting place, perhaps well meaning, well intentioned, but when taken to its logical extreme, that's when you have Valerie Solanas assassinating Andy Warhol in the name of feminism. That's extremist ideology at its worst. And I started thinking about what ideologies I can think of that are inherently peaceful. Now, there are plenty of ideologies that are neither inherently peaceful nor inherently violent. Um, but which are the ideologies that I can think of that require peacefulness as a core value? And only two sprang to mind, and that is Quakerism, which is a sort of a Christian subset that was fairly popular, I believe, in the 18th and 19th century, but doesn't seem to be that popular anymore. And Jainism, which has I believe it's either a Buddhist or a Hindu offshoot, which also espouses extreme non-violence and tolerance and being nice and kind and sweet to not only other people but all other living things. Jainists, I believe, are only allowed to eat fruit that's fallen off the tree. For example, they have to they walk around with little brushes so as to sweep insects out of the way so that they don't step on them and that kind of thing. It's an almost an extreme non-violent ideology. Quakerism is a bit more everyday functional than that, but they also have a, a commitment to pacifism. Pretty much any other ideology can, as far as I can tell, stretch into extremism. Even political ideologies that don't have a religious bent to them. So something like communism, um, although it sounds like a cool idea on paper, as soon as you try to implement it, that's when extremism rears its ugly head, because you have to have a near religious devotion to the cause, to the ideology, in order to make it work, in order to function within it. You have to believe that it's going to work if you're going to allow it to happen, because it's a top-down ideology. And when it inevitably starts to fail because it simply can't work, it's not compatible with human nature. Um, it's that extreme religious devotion to the ideology that lends people towards being violent in defending its core tenets from other people who are proving it wrong. And that's where you have things like the Ukrainian genocide. All right, I'm kind of waffling a little bit, and that's all this really was. It was just kind of a waffle and an introduction of some of these ideas and the things that I've been thinking about when it comes to ideology and religion. Um, what are your thoughts? What do you think about that? Drop a message in the comment below, or you can visit me on Discord over here. We can have a chat about it there, and if I have any more thoughts about that, I might put up more videos about that in the future. One more thing before I go, Patreon. My Patreon is still operational. If you head to patreon.com/D20, you can become a patron. I know that over the last couple months, Patreon has had a lot of, let's call it, controversy, with Sargon of Akkad being deplatformed by Patreon. A lot of other Patreon users, including big names like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, have left the platform. Patreon themselves seems to be having a really hard time of it over the last few weeks. They seem to be struggling to make payments. The platform is falling over. So it's not really clear what the current or future status of Patreon is as a platform until I have a solid idea for a better way of doing things. I'm going to stay on Patreon for now, but that's let me not say that I'm oblivious to what's going on. I am keeping an eye on the situation, and if I decide to move off of Patreon or open some other equivalent thing, maybe Subscribestar or something like that, you guys will be the first to know. As always, you can find me on the D20 Discord. We can have a chat there about this or anything else you feel like having a chat about. But that's it for now. Swat out.